Thank you, Rosalind, and thank you so much for the invitation to come here and celebrate your 150th anniversary. My talk is very much going to be about paying tribute to members of the Société who put together so much of the Paleolithic record, and as you'll probably see in 20 minutes' time, I'm not a historian, I'm an archaeologist, but I'm going to give you my history of Paleolithic archaeology through the endeavours of the Société, and think about the individuals who brought together all of this knowledge, who facilitated this knowledge, and take it right through to the present, so that we can begin to discuss the future of archaeology and the future of deep time on the island. I'm going to be steering largely away from geology, which is going to be covered by John Renouf this afternoon, but of course there'll be some overlaps. But let's use this to celebrate some of the people who put together this record. Well, the Paleolithic record really predates the Société in terms of its discovery. Unbeknownst to them at the time, Joseph Sinel and Samuel Dancaster, probably both about 17 at the same time, discovered flints at Le Côte-de-la-Chèvre. They didn't note much, we don't think, other than there were flints at Le Côte-de-la-Chèvre. Why did this get into the minds of two 17-year-olds? We can only think it's about their already education in the geology of Jersey and the availability of different types of raw material. Those seeds are there and they're planted. And really, Joseph Sinel, the first person I really want to celebrate, we'd think of him as an evolutionary biologist right now. Today, he was a systematizer of the Jersey Museum. He even fed in, was a consultant in the creation of the Karnak Museum. He was a heritage professional of his time and wrote two really important books, The Geology of Jersey and Prehistoric Times and Men of the Channel Islands in 1912 and 1914. Two books aimed at a popular audience, two books which haven't really yet been, the Prehistoric Times, I think, still needs to have its modern incarnation. Joseph Sinel was part of the team that carried out the first Paleolithic excavations we know of at Le Côte-de-la-Chèvre, probably around 1881. How that came about is probably a really important story, because 1881 is the year that Le Côte de Saint-Brelard is discovered. That's 20 years after Joseph Sinel and Dancaster are noting these strange flints. Why does it all come back in 1881? It's because one of those, Dancaster, at that point is exploring as, I would have thought, a 37-year-old man, the headland at the Côte de Saint-Brelard, and there discovers flints. But of course, the paradigm has changed. 1859, the Paleolithic is recognised, but of course by 1881 the Paleolithic has been shared through scientific communities. The Société is in existence, and the discoveries of the cave sites of France and the Somme Valley are being widely shared. So Dancaster knows exactly what he's finding at that point in time at Le Côte de Saint-Brelard, and of course, maybe excitedly, continues that conversation with Joseph Sinel, saying, remember the flints that we discovered at the other cave. So that very year, an excavation takes place at Le Côte-de-la-Chèvre. It is not a Société excavation. Joseph Sinel, in this quote here, says, we communicated the discovery to some of the members of the Société, but the matter was not taken up. We decided to continue the exploration on our own account. And this is a bit of a theme. When is an endeavour a Société endeavour in the history of Paleolithic archaeology? Or when someone is esteemed and so associated with the Société as Joseph Sinel is carrying out discoveries outside of an official capacity from the Société, really it's still part of the Société legacy, because that knowledge is feeding back here into the society. Attention shifts at this point for the latter part of the 19th century to Le Côte de Saint-Brelard. There's various attempts to capitalise on these early discoveries and these early finds, usually thwarted by the dangers of the site. We know there's a couple of campaigns in the 1890s, but in 1894 we got Nouri and Chapuis, Causson and Ribot attempting. They're thwarted because it's so dangerous. There's another attempt in 1905. It's thwarted because of collapsing rocks. So Le Côte takes a while to really have the challenges of its dangers met. But when those challenges are met in 1910, not only is there an incredible collection of individuals all bringing expertise to it, also have Emile Guiton there to capture the photography. And I've got there, I don't know, it's probably a very early selfie from Jersey of Emile Guiton. I can't imagine he did anything other than set that camera up himself. He's there with some friends. So it's a very remarkable photograph. But honestly, every single one of Emile Guiton's photos, which are here in the Société archive and have been generously shared with us by the Société, each one is for us an important scientific document, documenting the state of the cave, the state of excavations year by year, the individuals involved and the methodologies. So without that photographic archive, going alongside the endeavours of these gentlemen, led by Nicole and Sinel, but also with Marat, who at this point was a professor of anthropology, recently absolutely invigorated by his sudden passion for prehistory. The Société took on Le Cote de Saint-Brelade in 1910 and 1911. 3 weeks in 1910, 2 weeks in 1911, transformed the understanding because they were working with a professional team of engineers, quarrymen led by Ernest Daghorn and his expert, labour team to safely remove that perilous rubble and allow excavations to take place. I'm not here to discuss what was found. This is a history of the society. Think about the endeavour. Think about this didn't happen overnight. This was a site discovered in 1881. Some of the people are still here. It was attempted 3 times before. Everything comes together in August of 1910. The right people, the right resources, all focused on a Société in endeavour. A Marat quote here, the splendid results which have crowned the work of the Society will be fully explained in the pages that follow. But this was an incredible achievement. This was a point at which, and Marat knew this, let's introduce Robert Ranulph Marat. He knew this because he had spent preparation time working alongside French Paleolithic archaeologists, learning from them very rapidly, the Abbé Broyle, Comment, Perroni, great names actually bringing to London, them to see sites like Paviland, absolutely making that connection not only between Oxford and French Paleolithic archaeology, but Jersey and French Paleolithic archaeology. And there's important people like this who become anchors in the networks that are being created. And I think we've got to see the people who are actually on the ground making things happen and the people who are connecting through the Société these results, the understanding from the wider scientific community and feeding them in to understanding on the island. Marat will be picking up again and again, right through to the occupation when he ended up, unfortunately, I think fortunately for him, maybe in Oxford, but he did not survive the war. So we have a period here from 1910 through to 1940 where Marat continues to be active in promoting and encouraging and forwarding Paleolithic investigation. He takes on the excavations after 1912 on his own, effectively with funding from outside, from the British Association of Science, from the resources at Oxford, bringing over Oxford students, including the first females to excavate at Le Cote, which are his students. He does not have Dorothy Garrod amongst them, despite Dorothy Garrod being one of his students. That's an alternate reality where Dorothy would have come here and sorted out the Paleolithic and we could have all gone home. But he is bringing new people, new perspectives in through the end of the 19th century. The Société apparently wished him well and he could carry on their own. They had made their impact and their attention moved on elsewhere. Not going to go into it today, but there's an entire parallel story alongside the Société from the Jesuits especially Teilhard de Chardin, who's a regular visitor, who are developing their own understanding of the geology and to a degree the archaeology. It's interesting that, as far as I know, and please tell me if I'm wrong later on, there's very little connection in the early part of the 1910s. But it all comes together right at the end in 1918 when Father Morin deposits with the Société, finds from the Belhou cave of the dwarf deer, the discoveries that they made there, but apparently completely unaware of the discoveries of Teilhard de Chardin at the same cave, despite them being Jesuits, both at Maison St. Louis. So there's something interesting going on there. Arthur Morant wrote a whole paper on this, trying to work out how Father Morin was completely unaware of Teilhard de Chardin's discoveries, and did Burdeau, who we'll meet a little bit long, have a role in that as well. Also, just throw out at this point, just a complete mystery, a photograph from Emile Guiton of a skull which turned out to not be genuine, but we don't know why. It was apparently found at Le Cote de Saint-Brelade, turned out to be a hoax. That's all we know about it. So if anyone has any further information on that, I'll be very interested to know. Let's move forward to the 1930s. I needed to be 10 minutes in for the 1930s, and I'm there. So that's in the 1930s. Excavations recommenced at Le Cote de Saint-Brelade after a fairly decent hiatus of probably at least 15 years. Why do they get going again at that point in time? Well, Marat is heavily involved in getting them going again. He's drawing his attention back to the site. But I think there's two other individuals who we're going to pick up the story of now who were really throwing energy into it. First of all, Arthur Morant, who initially began his career as a geologist. Unfortunately, the depression apparently meant the career progression for him in geology didn't work out. Thankfully for the rest of humanity, he became a hematologist. And he kept on his interest in geology, publishing on the raised beaches, publishing on the Pleistocene, but also encouraging wider awareness of Jersey's Paleolithic archaeology. But also Christian Murdeau at this point has developed fully his interest in archaeology. He's there sharing experiences with Teilhard de Chardin, maybe even investigating Belhou Cave with Teilhard de Chardin 20 years earlier in the 1910s. But his interest isn't on archaeology. He spent some of his time as a relatively young man working on excavations in France, learning really sophisticated methodologies for their time in excavating, and he brings these back to the Société. And this is really where that Jesuit legacy and the Société in terms of archaeology come together in Christian Burdeau. And they, after excavating the pinnacle, Burdeau, Godfrey and Lomax bring their dream archaeological team to Le Cote de Saint-Brelade and attempt to make stable the West Ravine, which had been too precarious. Marat had abandoned it in 1918. They knew there was potential there, so they kept on working. I mentioned Arthur Morant. I think one of the most important things he did in the 1930s was he was part of bringing over Frederick Zoyner, who we'll meet later on. And from this point on, from the 1930s on, Arthur Morant is constantly there as a regular voice, encouraging and fostering the progression of Paleolithic archaeology, recognising its importance. I think we can kind of put together his interest in, human biology, in evolution. Of course, he published on domestication with Zoyner later. In this quote from him, I believe that studies of mankind, of the kind I have described, will add up to a true science of human biology. Gradually, on the one hand, dispelling the myths that hide man's biological origins, and on the other, giving him more and more control over his future evolution. Really interesting how he places the understanding of archaeology and evolution in terms of humanity understanding themselves and understanding their future. There's a really lovely resonance with this because Teilhard de Chardin in 1919, his last trip here before he never returned as far as we know to Jersey, had his first inklings of how he was going to harmonise Christian theology and human evolution. And it was here in Jersey that he wrote his first paper working towards that great work for which he became famous later on. In the 1930s, we also need to, I think, and each of these people I'm talking about could do with so much more historical research, look more deeply at the connection that brought Jacquetta Hawkes here to continue and finish the archaeology of Jersey. She made Paleolithic discoveries here. She brought an incredible knowledge of modern Paleolithic typology to that work. And that work, even though it's just summarising the artefacts at Le Cotte, the other finds from the wider landscape, which had received scant attention, puts them into for then a very modern, very erudite framework. And I think more can be teased out of the circumstances of Jacquetta Hawkes's visit here. Another visitor in the 1930s was Frederick Zoyner from my own institution, the UCL, it was just the Institute of Archaeology here, who as a geologist who was trying to put in a framework for understanding human evolution, saw raised beaches as being important, saw Le Cotte as being important, and also changed the course of excavations at Le Cotte. Because when Christian Berdow on his own took over excavations at Le Cotte de Saint-Brelade, he followed up on Zoyner discovering below the Société excavations from 1910, 1911, an older set of deposits that contained older artifact types. And this, and I'm sure John Renniff will explain in more detail later on, really opened up a whole set of unknown deposits at the site. We have the Société excavations led by Christian Berdow continuing through the 1950s. Wonderful to have him as a full member. What a wonderful synergy of experience from the Société and from his Jesuit legacy. And of course, he was teaching the children of Jersey. I've been lucky enough to meet people in the last 10 years who knew Father Berdow at that point in time. We have 5 minutes to go. The great handover of Le Cotte de Saint-Brelade excavations from Berdow as he reached the end of his career to Professor Charles McBurney, seen there on the left in lab coats inspecting some of Berdow's finds. I've spoken to the Société many times on the McBurney excavations. We're not going to give a history here, but I think there's a really important history here to look at how the Société negotiated that, how they first brought McBurney here. Was it McBurney's curiosity about it? What was McBurney's motivations? How did the Société meet that? What were the discussions? What were the conditions? Because this was a major, important collaboration, almost wholesale handing over the direction of the excavations to an external university team. Charles McBurney died relatively young in 1978, unpublished. And as we come to a close here, we must think of the very recent history, a very recent history where, of course, many people are still here, many people are still around, and this history is playing out even now. So we have this wonderful photograph here from 1982. We've got Anne McBurney, now the widow of Charles McBurney, the director of the Cambridge Museum, Professor John Coles from Cambridge Museum, who was overseeing the publication of Le Cotte, and Margaret Finlayson, who's acting here as one of the big conduits and connections between the Société and the site, and what to do about the site in the wake of Charles McBurney's death. And of course, one of the big Société sort of interventions there to preserve the site at that point is the creation of the wall. But we also have in the 1980s the excavations by Paul Callow there to get it published. And at this point, John Renniff becomes really important, having been someone who had been there when the McBurney excavations had been taking place, had witnessed them, had understood them, and was there in a position to work with Paul Callow to witness the site and actually contribute to the publication of the monograph. And there's a picture of John with Jean-Pierre Latredoux on the beach just to the south of Le Cotte. And of course, even Arthur Morant at this point, very precarious photograph there of Arthur Morant going down into the deep sounding with Paul Callow. So to bring to a close, here's a photograph which I've shown many times before of our first official visit as a team to Le Côte de Saint-Brelade, showing the reality as it was in 2009. We have John Renouf and Martin Bates, one of our geoarchaeologists, discussing there in the tableau the site history. We have Olga Finch from Jersey Heritage, an organisation which wasn't there during the McBurney excavations, but we're in a new reality where a new professionalised heritage organisation is here in Jersey. We have a number of different representatives from different universities continuing this legacy of connection and discussion and handing on the mantle of knowledge. We should also point out, that this photograph was taken by John Clark. So we have John Clark here, who at that point in time was the head of the archaeology section, recording this moment. When we come through to publication of our most recent book, we're lucky enough to have John Renouf as a contributor. We're lucky enough to have Kate Scott, one of McBurney's team, contributing to the book. We have French colleagues, Annelise Ravon, David Harrison, Pierre Antoine. I hope this sort of adds to that legacy of connection between the island, between other academics, and continuing to hand on that mantle. So to conclude, I think we need to think about the ebb and flow of the Société in lots of different subjects of interest. At some points becoming pivotal, at some points becoming supportive in a wider sense, in some points becoming more distant. I think for every subject there's ebb and flow there. It's imbibed through that combination of individual endeavour and a collective sense of responsibility, and it's thrived on the connections made with international scholarship. And in terms of archaeology, you now have the amazing appointment of Hervé here as your archaeologist, which brings that continued heritage of connections beyond the island. It's an intergenerational endeavour. In working on our latest phase at Le Côte de Saint-Brelade with Jersey Heritage, we're very much aware that we are now carrying on a very long-term intergenerational endeavour, and we will have to hand that on to other generations and leave a good record, which the Société have done brilliantly. There's still so many stories to tell about these individuals, their motivations, their connections, their psychologies, their challenges. Let's continue to tell those stories and find other voices and other people who haven't been quite so prominent. And for the future, let's all work together to reimagine the Société, now working in a very different reality to that in which it started, in one of its success stories, contributing to the fact that we now have professional heritage, professional curation. That is legacy of years of Société advocacy. And as Rebecca said at the beginning, a non-political organisation, but an organisation with a unique independent voice, which you shouldn't hold back on. And I know you never do. So thank you.